You're listening to Ingenuism's Silicon Valley Examined, where we delve into how the tech industry is helping create progress at the speed of thought. I'm Don Watkins. With me, as always, is Robert Hendershott. All right, Robert, good to have you this week. So we have a special guest this week. I'll let you introduce him since you have officially known him longer.
I have known Yaron Brook for, it seems like most of my life at this point. We've done academic research together, we've started businesses together, and now we are becoming evangelists of Ingenuism together. So Yaron is joining us today to talk about the real winners from Ingenuism.
Thanks, guys. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, and so when I think about this issue of winners of Ingenuism, the way I think about it is, why do we see it in some places rather than others, some regions rather than others, some sectors rather than others, some professions or companies? And I thought we could start off just with, if we want to zoom out to the biggest picture of countries, where are the places that you think this is a real example of what's possible when we respect the principles of Ingenuism?
And I think that if you think about kind of the principles of Ingenuism, exploration, connection, and environment, the countries that are going to benefit the most from this are the countries that have created an environment in which exploration and connection are thriving, or cultures. It's not always countries, because it's not always top down. It's often more of a cultural issue, a culture that embraces exploration and connection. And you see that in different parts of the world, in different cultures, in different areas. I mean, obviously, you see that in the United States. United States has always been a place where Ingenuism has done, if you compare it across the globe, relatively well. Whether it was in the late 19th century, whether it's today in Silicon Valley or in other centers like Silicon Valley, cultures have developed that allow for exploration and connection internally within a particular community, and then externally with everybody outside of that community. It has to do with culture's attitude to things like failure and being willing to stand out, and being willing to be different than the norm and the average and the conventional, to be unconventional. And America, because it's been free and because it was started by these mavericks that rebelled against kind of the conventional world, the world of the 18th century Europe, I think has always had that rebelliousness in it, that adventure, exploration as part of that culture. And I think that has manifested in the country and then concentrated for a variety of reasons, which we can talk about, in a place like Silicon Valley. We can talk about other countries. Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's really important to add that we're not talking about winners and losers. We're talking about winners and winners. And that there's two sides to that coin, because you definitely have the areas that are sort of predisposed to take advantage of this new regime the most. And Silicon Valley would be the premier example. But then you have other smaller areas like Tel Aviv in Israel that have adopted the principles and seen an enormous influx of ideas and talent and enormous wealth creation. And that the benefit, one of the core pieces, I was talking about exploration, but one of the core pieces of connection is that everybody benefits. And the world has gotten very connected. There's nowhere that isn't, at least unless you self-impose it like a North Korea or Cuba, that doesn't have access to all of the progress that's being made in the world. Now, it's not equal, but relative to the imaginary world where we weren't connected, everybody is better off. And you could argue that actually the areas that struggle are the most better off because they're able to tap into what's happening in the areas like Silicon Valley that are making the most progress. So, you imagine a world where every country had 1,000-foot walls built around it. You would have vaccines for COVID in a few countries, and the rest of the world would have no access and no idea how to get it.
But it's still true, though, that part of our mission, in a sense, with Ingenuism is to convince everybody to create the kind of environment that allows for Ingenuism to happen, because that makes them richer and everybody else richer. That is, them better off and everybody else better off. So countries that embrace these ideas are leaders in bringing this, and then Connection spreads that to everybody, so everybody benefits. But the more people are part of this Ingenuist environment, part of innovation and creation and production and new ideas, all of us benefit. And of course, they benefit even more when they embrace it. And I think here Israel is a good example, right? So you brought up Israel. Israel's an interesting place, a tiny little country with a relatively small population, very, very innovative, very, very technologically advanced, producing a lot of the software and a lot of the hardware that we use day to day. So everybody's benefited from it. But Israel has gone from a relatively poor country when I was growing up there to an advanced economy today. It's one of the top economies in the world because it embraced some of the ideas in Ingenuism. I wish it embraced more of them, but some of them. And I think part of the question that's interesting is, why do some countries do it and others don't? What is it about the culture of a particular people, maybe a particular region, that allows for the embrace of ingenious ideas? And what is it about cultures that don't? One of the things that there's a certain rebelliousness about Ingenuism. It's about going against the status quo. And I think that one of the things about Israeli culture is we always argue. Bob will find this a huge surprise. So will Don, right? That we're a culture of argumentative people. The dining room table on a Friday night is the family gets together and everybody yells at everybody else, argues about stuff. And there's no putting people down because you disagree with them. There's no putting people down because they're outliers or because they have kind of different ideas. There's the engagement in a debate. And I think that kind of culture that embraces debate, discussion, differences of opinions is a culture that is going to be a culture of explosion, but also a culture of connection, because that debate, that discussion is what establishes connection. If I can change your ideas, or if I can broaden your ideas of the scope of what you think about, that is partially what connection is about.
Well, you both raised an interesting point, which is, so you talked about the change in Israel where it became kind of more open to Ingenuist principles. Robert, you mentioned the difference between North and South Korea, like those kind of contrasting cases where we see either kind of same culture but different environment leads to different results, or we see the same culture change over time and it makes it lead to different results. That seems very useful in helping us isolate and think about what's really driving innovation, what's really driving progress, and what's holding it back. Robert, any thoughts on that?
Well, I completely agree with that. In a sense, we're looking at the fossil record and trying to draw clues on it. But I would say two things. One is that connection is only valuable when there's diversity in views. If you connect with people who think exactly like you do, know the exact same things as you, have the same skills, talents, you're not going to get any 1 + 1 = 3. And then the second thing is that when you have a culture that starts, and Don, you've talked about this, like being sort of catching the entrepreneurial bug. If you have a culture that starts both trying new things, adopting Ingenuist principles, and then it works, it creates its own momentum. And that's why if you're a North Korea, you have to keep the shutters closed, because if anyone had any idea what was possible, they would rebel in an instant.
Yeah, and in openness is so crucial to all of this. And again, it goes back to connection. But openness to immigration, think about Silicon Valley and the role immigrants have played from the beginning and ongoing in the creation of new companies, bringing in new ideas and attracting the best and the smartest from a variety of different places in the world. Now, to some extent, that is less important today when we can do everything virtually, but it's still, there's something about being geographically close that adds value. Israel is a place that has brought people in from a variety of different places around the world and brought them into one place, and an openness to ideas from all over the globe. So I think those are crucial. And then the willingness to engage. I mean, if you think about history, Japan went through this period where it was completely isolated itself. It refused European ships. It wouldn't communicate with the Chinese. And it completely built a wall, in a sense, around itself. And it was stagnant. Nothing happened. And as soon as Japan lowered that and allowed for interaction and trade and exchange of ideas, it started to grow dramatically from an economic perspective. And North Korea has to maintain those walls if they want to control their people and if they don't want this ingenuism to grow and expand, or the economy and people to get new ideas. Because if they get new ideas about technology, they might get new ideas about self-representation, about sovereignty, and about a lot of other things. So they have to keep it clamped down. China is walking a delicate balance because on the one hand, they have centralized authority. On the other hand, they have openness economically. And I think that is the big part of the tension within China moving forward in terms of, for the last 40 years, in terms of how do they balance that so that they allow economic growth and economic progress, but at the same time keep control. And is that really sustainable in the future? It seems to me one has to give. Either they clamp down on the economy or they lose political control, but they're trying to do both at the same time.
Let me switch to a different topic, which is in thinking about industry. So if we're talking about winners of Ingenuism, there's an interesting question of how you'd classify an industry like healthcare. Because on the one hand, we've had these amazing breakthroughs like the COVID vaccines. On the other hand, in many respects, it feels like it's backwards, bureaucratic. Like the fact that we can't increase the number of beds in a hospital rapidly seems like an unbelievable disaster. Or the fact that we don't all have, what did they, N95? I always get the numbers wrong. Masks a year and a half after the pandemic. Like we can't print up little paper masks. What is your take? I'll start with Robert on does medicine get a thumbs up or a thumbs down from an Ingenuist perspective?
Like most things, medicine gets a thumb sideways. All of the problems you point to are real, and they're real in every country that I'm aware of, because, and it relates to what we were talking about, like even countries, whether we're talking about countries, sectors, companies, the essence of whether you're benefiting from this new world comes down to, are you connected, and are you exploring new ways of doing things, and are you learning from your mistakes and your successes as you proceed? And medicine is a hard one, because if you make mistakes, people can die, and so it tends to be very conservative. Exploration is slow and often suppressed, and it's an area where we definitely appeal to authority. You do what the doctor says, or at least before the internet, you used to. And that's that sort of mindset where someone is going to come up with a plan, some expert is going to tell us what to do, is a completely antithetical to Ingenuism. And in Ingenuism, everyone is contributing because everyone has a different perspective, has different skills, and in medicine, we really do think somehow that a small number of people can sit in Washington and redesign the healthcare system and have it come out well. And there's no way in my mind that you would ever think that that's possible. But people believe it, and entire countries believe it. And I think that's why there are places in the world that haven't embraced Ingenuism. But I just want to point to a big success, the opposite, because we do have to give the thumbs up where the thumbs up are deserved, and that's in surgery. This past summer, my dad's blood pressure was very low. He went to the Mayo Clinic. They said, I think we should put a pacemaker in. It was outpatient surgery. He had outpatient heart surgery. It was minimally invasive, and minimally invasive surgery is something that the idea has been around for centuries, maybe even millennium. Is the idea that you could somehow operate without having to cut open is just such a huge improvement over having to cut open. So you see in Star Trek where you wave a little beeping device over people and they get better. But we basically have done that. Now you have to cut maybe a half-inch hole. And there are some stitches, and you have to go to the doctor and be there for hours instead of minutes. But it's really amazing, and it's pretty recent because the first laparoscopic surgeries, which is really for taking out the appendix, because you don't want to cut into you have to take out the appendix. You don't want to cut into the entire abdomen. That was in the 1980s. The first robotic surgery was in the 21st century. It was in the 2000s. Intuitive Surgical, which is an amazing success story in the healthcare business, because they took what were invasive and what's a polite way to put it, risky, roll of the dice, idiosyncratic surgeries, and they turned them into non-invasive, robot-controlled, incredibly consistent and safe, given that you're actually cutting into a human body and messing around with critical organs, procedures. And that is in the last 20 years. And that kind of success, where you start with an idea, and the idea of minimally invasive surgery is the real foundational innovation. And then once people turn their attention to it and they start thinking, how can we do this better? That's where you get the real miracles. And so inside of healthcare, I think that in the areas where we've allowed for exploration and we've taken advantage of the opportunity to learn and get better, we've seen truly miracles. And in other areas, we're doing the same. We're doing things the exact same way that we were doing them, 30 or 40 years ago. And that seems crazy.
Yeah. So just to reinforce that, I mean, I've had several back surgeries, three of them, but two, you could tell the difference, right? In 1980, I had my first back surgery. They cut me open. I mean, I've got a big scar. They opened it up. They had to chop stuff away to get to the point where they needed to go. It took months to recover, physical therapy for a long, long time. It was a major, major big deal. I've had surgery in my back more recently, and the last one was outpatient, and a robot went in. It's amazing what they can do. The incision is tiny, and the recovery is it's still recovery, but it's much shorter, much easier than it used to be. So today they can fuse your disc. They can put in hardware through tiny little holes that they put in you, rather than just opening up like they did in the old days. So, and the other example I think is the flip side of that is this example of not just doctors being the authority, but doctors looking for authority. I had a doctor for a while. He didn't last as my doctor for very long. Every time I would go in, we'd say, okay, well, let's say this number in your blood is a little off. And he'd basically Google some medical website, right, of the authorities, the government medical website. He'd say, well, this is what everybody says we should do about it. And it was like, I'm interested in what you think we should do about it. And he would say, this is what, and he would refuse to give an opinion. He would always revert to the commonly acceptable opinion that's published by the national authorities. And that is incredibly destructive to Ingenuism. And that's what happens when you, in a sense, centralize the planning of healthcare. And one of the problems with healthcare is that so much of it is centralized. And what happens is that the innovations happen at the margins, where the environment still allows for exploration, innovation, for trial, and for connection. And talk about connection, right? Over 70% of all medical innovations happen in the United States, which also happens to have the freest healthcare environment in the world. So because we're innovating, though, all these other countries, even though they have centrally planned healthcare systems, benefit from the innovations that we come up with. So exploration in the US through connectivity is then transferred into increased quality of healthcare all over the world. And I think people don't quite appreciate how much American healthcare freedom is benefiting everybody across the entire planet. But as Robert said, it's a thumb sideways because it's such a mixture. It's a mixture of environments that encourage exploration and in environments that don't encourage exploration. And our goal is to take those and try to move them in the direction of encouraging exploration and figuring out ways to make that possible in spite of the life or death outcomes that are possible under healthcare. And you can only really even get to that. What kind of structures work in healthcare that allow for that? You can only get to that with a degree of freedom. So the movement has to be towards creating the environment that encourages exploration and connection. And that means an environment of more and more freedom. I had a treatment on my back, which involved stem cells. It was exploration. Nobody knew if it would work. And I got stem cells injected into where I didn't have any disc. It worked amazingly well. But because of the centrally planned regulatory environment, my doctor just doesn't want to do it again. And he stopped doing it. And now it's very, very difficult to get a stem cell treatment for the back. That's the kind of stifling impact you get on innovation. So there are not a lot of cases. So we can say, okay, you're on, but do we know if it works on 100 other people? We don't know because we don't have the other 99 people, at least not from this particular doctor. And in many cases, Americans have to go to a place like Mexico or some of the Caribbean islands to get these kind of treatments because of the stifling of innovation done through central planning.
So you guys are both finance guys. So that's another interesting industry because I would say there, most people's view is it's been too innovative. And that's a cause of all kinds of problems. Now, I mean, Yaron and you and I have written an entire book about this. So I know that this is a complicated thing, but what's your take on Ingenuism and finance today?
So again, I think the two different worlds in a sense in finance today. So up until recently, most of the innovation in finance has been to get around regulation, to get around the stifling impact of the central planners, the people who thought they could regulate finance into straitjacketed into a particular format. That format failed, and as a consequence, finance continually tried to find ways around it. You can't pay interest on checking accounts, so we create money market accounts. You can't give interest to corporate accounts, so we create a euro-dollar market, because in Europe you are allowed to pay interest on checking. I mean, just constant innovation around that. But then in parallel, there's been innovation that has really been productive. And you see that across all financial markets, but particularly in the last, I don't know, maybe it's 20 years since the late 90s. You've seen innovation outside of the sphere of regulations. You've seen finance, you've seen new institutions arising, and much of this today is called fintech, that have carved little niches outside of the regulatory world or in a space where regulation was looser, was not quite as restrictive as it is, for example, on banks. And that's where really exciting things are happening, have happened, and I think will happen. The world of traditional finance, we're only seeing more regulations and more regulatory burden for the most part. Some things have been deregulated, but for the most part. But at the spaces where exploration is allowed, at the spaces where failure is allowed, that's another interesting. Finance is also interesting with regard to failure, right? So much of finance is too big to fail. Well, nothing should be too big to fail. Nothing should not be allowed to fail if it deserves failure. That's how you learn. You learn, you innovate, you advance, but in the spaces, again, that are less regulated, failure is allowed, experimentation is allowed. And those areas is where exciting things are happening. And also, if you look at other countries, so A lot of innovation in fintech has happened in China. And just up until recently, up until the Chinese clamping down on Alibaba in its various spinoffs, but there was immense innovation there because there wasn't a regulatory setup in China, right? They went from communism to kind of something. It's hard to define exactly what they have in China without creating an entire regulatory structure. So a lot of stuff just evolved naturally from the marketplace. So they came up with a lot of payment mechanisms, a lot of insurance mechanisms, a lot of capital raising mechanisms that were innovative and new that couldn't have evolved in the US because they would have been stifled by regulation. And the same is true to some extent in Europe. In some respects, Europe is less regulated, less controlled than the US. And we're seeing a lot of interesting fintech coming out of Europe in areas where it's harder to innovate in the US around. So, but connection allows us to see what they're doing, learn from what they're doing, and allows US companies to learn from what is successful in these other countries and to fit it into kind of the regulatory framework we have in the US. And it's truly amazing how much innovation is happening in spite of the controls that exist on finance.
I'd add that there's a huge amount of conservative and resistance to change in even the private finance in the US. I mean, if you go back into the 80s, there was a clever partnership between regulators and the thrift industry that made everybody happy until it broke down. And then you had the savings and loan crisis, and it cost hundreds of billions of dollars, back when hundreds of billions of dollars was real money. And so there is a tendency for the incumbent companies to be quite happy with how things are. And it shows up in odd ways. It shows up in regulations that don't seem like they make any sense, but it also shows up in a tendency to not adopt technology that seems really, really obvious in hindsight. I mean, I remember, banking back when I was very young, and you could not see, like if you went in to sign something, if it wasn't your branch and if there's another branch of your bank, they couldn't see your signature anywhere because it was on a piece of paper in a file cabinet. And this is a time where digital imaging had already started. You already had copy machines, you had fax machines. And it wasn't until an outside company, and it was actually the first fintech company called Jack Henry and Associates, started providing systems that took it from the customer to the bank in one fell swoop, so providing the hardware and the software, that you started to see adoption of really simple stuff like remote deposit capture, which even in the 90s and early 2000s was like a big deal for banks, that they could now let their customers deposit checks without having to come to the branch using one of these $2,000 machines. I mean, it seems crazy, right? We can all just take a picture of a check with our smartphone and have it deposited in an instant. But no, it was complicated systems. It cost thousands of dollars. And this was less than 20 years ago. And then it was because banks had no incentive. And that's because regulation doesn't just constrain the incumbents, but it also protects them. And Jack Henry, I think, is a $13 billion company today, wildly successful, a company, though, that's been around for 40 years and is no longer at the cutting edge at all, because companies like PayPal and Square and Stripe, these are all companies that are worth 10 or 25 times as much because they're doing so much more. And you finally have the large incumbent banks making investments in technology to give their customers the relationship and the experience that they're looking for, because now they're faced with this outside competition, whether it's sort of mild competition from a credit union, or whether it is serious competition from a cryptocurrency, that is existential threat. They now see that technology is their future. But this is in 2020, and in the year 2000, banks were barely investing in websites.
So, I mean, it's interesting how insidious regulation can be, because it completely changes the incentives and the motivations. It attracts conservative people are going to be attracted to industries where there's not a lot of change. So it's not surprising that you get a bunch of CEOs who are very conservative in terms, because to some extent they choose that industry. It's the exception that is willing to push the envelope against. I mean, would SNLs even have existed if not for the way regulation structured in the 1930s to kind of promote and home ownership and create savings and loans institutions? Who knows? I mean, maybe some would have existed, some would have not. There are all kinds of issues around moral hazard, around risk-taking, that without regulations, it's really hard to imagine what finance would look like. We don't have a model in the modern world of what financial markets would look like without regulations. We can imagine it, and we can see some of these innovative companies and pushing the envelope and see kind of where they could go. But people attack finance, and they often don't realize how constrained financial markets really are. And in the US, more than any other country, in a weird kind of way. So I remember first coming to the US in 1987, and ATMs were just starting. Whereas in Europe, ATMs has existed for quite a while before that. American banks have been particularly conservative in terms of adopting technology, much because I think they've been more heavily directly regulated and controlled than financial systems around the world.
And we tend to have a status quo bias if you think about regulating financial institutions, the need for regulation and what the regulation would look like in 2021 can't possibly be the same as it was in 1980. And yet we have basically the same regulatory regime and no opportunity to experiment with different ones outside of completely moving into a niche market. And that's what's so exciting about fintech and even more so distributed finance and cryptocurrencies is, even though I think a lot of it is crazy, it's all experimentation that wasn't happening before and that we can learn from. Even if things blow up or if they go incredibly well, we'll learn really important lessons that could allow us to not redesign the financial system for the future, but to let the financial system evolve into something that makes sense for the 21st century.
Yeah, which reminds me, if anybody wants to buy an NFT of the Ingenuism logo, we'll start the bidding at $8 million. We're getting close to the end of time, but I did want to go to the company level for a minute because, we so often, if you talk about innovation, the first companies that come to mind and tend to dominate the conversation, and deservedly so in many ways, are companies like Google, Apple. But I'm interested in, feel free to take on any company you're on. But Robert, I want to start with you because when we were talking about this, you mentioned probably my favorite company on earth, because this is how I start my day every day, which is I wake up, between 4 and 5 or so. And the first thing I do, because I'm a health nut, is grab a Monster energy drink and drink that in an empty stomach. And so I know you had some thoughts on what they're doing.
Well, it's easy to think about innovation like Intuitive Surgical, where you have a company that takes an idea that's very innovative and then applies another very innovative piece to it, robotics, and then creates something that is truly magical. And then they dominate the sector and they end up being, a $130 billion company. And that's easy, an easy example. Or even Jack Henry, where, you start out and you make a difference. And then, of course, you're trumped by the companies that come along later and really move outside of, don't just support activity inside the existing sector, but move outside of the sector and start doing really new things. But the other way that you can really contribute, and you see this if you're looking for ingenuism, you see this everywhere, is to take what is already out there and then add something new and interesting to it. And that's why, Monster has been so successful. And Monster was actually founded in 1935. It was a California juice company. So if you really were a health nut, you could have been drinking Hansen juices. And if you remember back in the 1980s or even the early 90s in California, at least, you could buy Hansen's natural soda, none of this stuff was very popular. So the company went bankrupt in 1988. Of course, when you go bankrupt, you don't disappear. You're taken over by creditors. They sold it to another beverage company, ended up going public, still making juice in 1995. But that's right around when Red Bull came to America. And we always talk about connection and innovation going from the US to other places. Well, Red Bull started in Europe. And it was brought to the US in California in 1997. So at this time, you've got Monster as a already gone bankrupt once, struggling juice company. And so in 2000, I think it was 2002, they introduced Monster Energy. So Don, I don't know why you're a Monster and not a Red Bull fan, but with that
cost,
Monster
has undercut them by about a third.
And there were three things that Monster did. So Red Bull was the dominant. I mean, Red Bull was founded, I don't know, they made the first drinks in the 70s or the early 80s, but decades before Monster. And they still are the biggest globally, the biggest energy drink company. But Monster took on bringing cheaper, because Red Bull is very expensive, still is, and more, I'll call it personalized beverages. So, Red Bull was Red Bull, and Monster would trot out different flavors. And this is Ingenuism, because when you're small and you are in second place by a wide margin, you have nothing to lose by experimenting and exploring. And so you can bring out flavors, you can see what people like, not just in like a study group or a focus group, but actually in the store shelves. You can play around with prices. You can provide a different option than the basic Red Bull. And this has been wildly successful. I mean, Monster actually, is about 6 years ago, they did a big transaction with Coke. And this is after they had gone public and they had changed their name to Monster. And they swapped all of their non-energy drink lines to Coke. And in exchange for Coke's energy drink lines, because Coke had been trying to introduce energy drinks because it was a growing market. But Coke has a real problem doing that sort of experimentation. Well, you just look back at New Coke, having a big market share and a strong brand, fooling around with it can be very costly. And so this transaction allowed Monster to become the second largest energy drink company in the world. Coke bought a sixth of Monster for like $2 or $3 billion, and they got the distribution of the Coke bottling system. And so Monster now is almost has almost the same market share as Red Bull, and it didn't invent the energy drink at all, but it took the existing energy drink concept and then applied cheaper and more variety and learn what customers really want and run with it to become wildly successful. And they're a $50 billion company.
All right, Yaron, you get to pick a company that will astonish us with its.
I'm not going to pick a company. I think I've known Robert for 30 years. I had no idea he knew anything about sports drinks, but wow. One of the amazing things is that in our day to day, how many products that we interact with are innovative, new, constantly evolving, and then we just take for granted and we don't think twice about them. I mean, think about all the packaging materials and types that exist to make sure that our food is fresh, that our food is protected, that it can travel long distances, that it can get to us when we need it, where we need it. You walk into a grocery store, and particularly if you come from a country that doesn't have the kind of grocery stores we have in the United States, where you have the variety and the choice and the kind of packaging that maintains things in the way that it does in the US. It truly is astounding. So you have all this variety, all this choice, all preserved for you. Somebody has to constantly be thinking, constantly be innovating in terms of how to make that possible and how to sustain it over the long run. Robert is standing at a standing desk. I'm standing at a standing desk. Who ever heard of standing desks? I mean, it's a completely new phenomena. Some somebody decided at some point
not a chair maker.
Not a chair maker. That standing was better than sitting. Some doctor, announced this, and all of our physicians have bought into this idea, and we as obedient patients have bought into it, and so there's a whole industry, and it's not just like there's one or two companies for standing desks. There's a huge variety of standing desks in terms of style, in terms of sophistication, in terms of programmability. Standing desk. I mean, it's absurd. Not only am I standing at a standing desk, but I'm standing on top of one of these things that moves a little bit, because supposedly that's good for your for your stability, and there's a variety of those things. I mean, we are surrounded by a wealth that is truly unimaginable, certainly unimaginable to anybody even 30, 40 years ago, in terms of the kinds of products, the variety of products, the personalization. Robert talked about personalizing Monster drinks, but all of these things, like the standing desk, all personalized by dimensions, by color, by, again, programmability, by how you want to use it, what you want to use it for. So, we think in terms of technology. We think, oh, Zoom, there's the big innovation, right? And it is. It's amazing and stunning. But the connection, the exploration, the attitude is around us. I mean, we were talking this morning about 3M and about adhesives and about the variety of adhesives that have come out of 3M and all kinds of strange combinations that nobody thought would be useful and have turned out amazingly useful, from duct tape to cellophane to sticky notes, to all these things that all come from adhesives. And why do they come from there? Because they built a culture that is about ingenuity and innovation and letting people try things and fail and explore and come up with crazy ideas and go try them out, not stifle them. So when it's properly done, it's in every aspect of our lives. And I think that this is why, we focus on technology, because there the speed of innovation is so high. And partially, I think that's because it's created its own kind of very pro-innovation environment. But if we allowed those kind of environments to exist for every other industry, it's hard to imagine the kind of innovation and kind of progress we would see in all industries. We talked about finance. Imagine if we allowed fintech for that environment to dominate all of finance. I mean, it's hard to imagine what financial markets would look like. They'd look very different than they look like today.
All right, Robert, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yay.
Not again. God.
Well, I'm just going to follow you, Yaron, just like always. It's really easy to think about the biggest winners being these big technology companies, because they've just done such amazing things, and they've created companies of a size and influence that we've never seen before. Or the founders, think that, well, obviously it's Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, and these are the people who are the biggest winners from Ingenuism. And I would say, yeah, that's actually true. And if you were to add up the benefits that are accruing to the 7 billion other people on the planet, it's actually a drop in the bucket. And it could be so much more. We have sectors that are, that are embracing and actually leading the evolution of what we call Ingenuism. But we also have many more sectors that are not taking those same steps, that are not taking advantage of what's possible today. We have countries that are and regions in particular that are taking advantage of it, and then we have others that are not. And that the biggest winners today are potentially just they are potentially dominated by what's possible going forward. And so I'd love to get back together with you guys in a decade and talk about the companies that we didn't even see coming, and the innovations that people put together that we had no idea were about to show up, because that's what's on our horizon.
Thanks to Robert. Thanks to our special guest, Yaron Brook, The best way to stay in touch is to go to ingenuism.com and sign up for our weekly Substack newsletter. We will be with you next week.